Welcome to Building the Future. I'm your host, Kevin Horick. You can check out new episodes of the show every Tuesday and Thursday at 2 p.m. If you missed an episode or want to get more information about the show, please visit buildingthefutureshow.com. Welcome back to the show. Today we have Kristina DiPalo, strategic communications consultant, leadership coach, and founder of Daily Work Life. Kristina, welcome to the show.
Hi, Kevin.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you on the show today. I think what you're doing is actually really quite interesting, and you have quite an impressive background. But before we maybe get into exactly what you're doing now, let's get to know you a little bit better and cover kind of where you grew up.
That's great. I was born and raised in New Jersey. I guess you could call me a Jersey girl.
Sure.
I went to a very nice middle-class high school in northern New Jersey. Went to college here. I did my undergraduate work at Rutgers College.
Okay, what did you take?
In economics.
Oh, okay.
I studied economics. The dismal science, as they call it. I actually started out as a French and language major, but I wound up minoring in that and then finishing up in economics. Went out, got a job, like most people did, right during the real big boom of Wall Street in the late 1980s.
Gotcha.
And, decided after I had been working for a few years doing investment accounting, which for people who know me really well, would say that that's probably the oddest job fit that they could imagine. I decided I kind of wanted to make a change, even though, money and economic markets and the financial markets is theoretically interesting to me. It's not something that I enjoyed on a day-to-day basis. So I started to pursue graduate studies in corporate communications. And I got a master's from Seton Hall University, again, a Jersey school, a really good private Jersey school. And I started to shift my career over to focusing on communications and not really knowing what exactly I wanted to focus on at the time. I just knew that I kind of wanted to work in that area. So my employer, which was a large insurance company, was really, they were really amenable to me kind of making that shift and moving from, investment and portfolio accounting over into more communications and marketing related work. And it kind of allowed me to find my way. And eventually I moved over into sales communications, field support communications, and then more executive work. And when I finished up my grad degree, it was a perfect opportunity for me to kind of leave that initial employer and then jump to a new one. So I moved to PR work at Moody's Investor Service, one of the large and well-known rating agencies in New York. And I worked with them for about 4 or so years. Had a lot of fun there. It's a really interesting, it's an arcane kind of business, but it's really fascinating as well. And I wound up doing external and media relations support for 2 of the largest analytical franchises there, the Financial Institutions Group, so banks and sovereign nations and large financial, companies, securities companies, as well as their structured finance group, which was equally fascinating. So, a lot of the stuff that you read about with all of these rather esoteric securities that, were behind the financial crisis in 2008, and this was a number of years before that, I worked helping to support that group. So I really learned a lot about those products at that time. But then, life intervened, and I moved from being in the financial services industry to moving over to the pharmaceutical industry. And in New Jersey at the time, this was around 2001. You couldn't really drive anywhere for more than about 10 or so miles without seeing a large pharmaceutical company. The state has changed a bit since that time.
Okay.
A lot of companies have moved to other areas, but at that point it was there were a lot around. And my husband and I were starting our family, and I said I really wanted to work in a place that was closer to home because my life was changing.
Sure. No, that makes a lot of sense.
Absolutely. It's funny. I'm sure that you've had instances where, you kind of have an idea in your mind as to where you want your career to go.
Totally.
And then something happens in your life and you're like, oh, gee, maybe I'll try something different. Or maybe what I thought was important isn't as important anymore.
Totally. No, I think that everybody kind of goes through that at some point, right? I think.
Yeah. Exactly. And you almost have to have a bit of blind faith that,
Totally.
okay, maybe this wasn't like in my big plan, but it's probably the smartest thing I could do. So what the heck, let me just do it.
Sure. So you kind of jumped around a bunch of industries. At what point did you
Yep.
kind of decide to do your own thing?
Well, when I moved to pharma, I kind of, timing is everything, right? So when I moved over to pharma, the industry was really going through a huge merger and acquisition period.
Okay.
So I joined a company that doesn't exist anymore, that was bought out by Pfizer. And I, for various reasons, I stayed with Pfizer. And because I was there after they had bought not only my company, but another company just prior to that, there was a lot of change going on. And I started to move into doing more communications that was focused on integrating companies together.
Okay, interesting.
Stayed with them for a while. And for a lot of those companies, now companies are kind of used to it. I think that there's been a lot more of that activity, especially in the pharmaceutical industry in the past decade and a half. But at the time, it was a little novel. So, there was a lot that we were kind of like trying to figure out, which I found really, really fascinating. And you really wind up looking at how people are working and the organizations that they're working in and figuring out, this is a lot more than just focusing on what's happening outside and are you making your sales and are you discovering new products. How people work and how they think and feel about their work on the inside determines almost everything. I mean, it helps drive how successful you're going to ultimately be. So let's pay attention to this because it's really important. And that gave me an appreciation, I think, that if I hadn't gone through that experience, I would never have gained.
Interesting.
So I stayed with them. Yeah, it really was. It was pretty cool.
Yeah, no, I love, I'm always kind of fascinated by how people kind of get to where they are. And like you just kind of mentioned it, a lot of it's based on kind of like life experience.
Oh, yeah, I know. I'll sometimes say that I've been the recipient of a lot of happy accidents in my life. And I think you just have to be smart enough, okay, I get the big sign from the above, from the universe, so I'll just go with it.
Sure.
But then I left that company, went to another pharmaceutical company, and they turned around and they then suddenly did a big merger, 7-8 months after I joined them.
Wow.
And because they hadn't done a lot of them in the past, they sort of pulled me up into a really, critical role in terms of the integration, in the integration management office. So that was great. And it kind of, it helped me along the way say, I find this work to be really interesting. Helping a company as it's trying to go through something that in many ways is uncomfortable, but necessary.
Right.
And at the same time, it really helped me start looking at how do leaders fit into that whole process? Are they ready for what they're being called on to do? Or do they recognize that they need to get better or more skillful at something? Because so much hinges on how they lead an organization and a company through these times of really transformational change. So a few years after that, in late 2011, I thought, I've kind of wanted to go out on my own for a few years, but it just didn't feel right. My gut told me, not yet. And suddenly in 2011, the time was right. Okay. So that's when I made the move.
I'm always curious, what was did something in your gut just kind of change, or what was the feeling, or what was was there some sort of thing that happened that was okay, this is the right time, or you just kind of knew?
Mm-hmm. I, yes. I mean, kind of like, the answer is yes to both in a
Okay.
way. What was happening in the company was that even though they had done the merger a year and a half prior at this point, they still had to do a lot more change.
Okay.
And having been on the inside, and the kind of change that they were doing was, more restrictive, more, we have to do this in order to get through the next few years kind of change, not, wow, we're going to put forth a brand new growth platform. And I've worked with companies on that too. The feeling within the company and the mindset in those two scenarios is quite different. So what I was facing in 2011 was we're going to have to shrink a little bit more. And, we're going to have to do more with less to get through the next few years. And having been through similar circumstances in the past, I said to myself, I've been here before. I know what I want to do. What I want to do really is grow something. And although I could stay here, it was never a question of, do I have a job or not? I thought, everything is kind of coming together perfectly. And this is the time now for me to make a move.
Sure. And I guess like worst case scenario, you could always go back to the corporate world, right?
Yes. Although, I have to say that with more time, with each year that I'm out on my own, I love working in corporate environments and having clients working in those environments. But I don't know if I personally would ever want to go into that kind of environment again.
Got you. Okay. No, that's totally fair. So what's the company and what do you guys kind of do, and kind of, I guess, what was the real reason you kind of decided to start the company?
Yes. So the company is Elysian Communications. So,
Okay.
that's a tip to, in Greek mythology, the Elysian Fields, right? Paradise.
Right.
I didn't want to name the company after me. Just that's kind of like a personal thing. So, I was sort of like trying to go through names, and figure out something that sounded a little bit unique and kind of rolled off the tongue in an interesting way. And I'm like, scrolling on the internet and it just kind of appeared before me. So I thought, well, okay, that's a sign. Let's just run with it. But what we do is, we focus on transformational change. So helping companies figure out how they want to talk about and drive the mindset when you have to do some type of transformational change. So, I do work within the M&A field. I do large scale, corporate transformation. The company says, gee, we have to kind of change the way that we're doing something. Fundamentally, maybe the way that we're structured, maybe the things that we want to focus on, the markets that we go after, maybe just the way that we organize ourselves. As well as helping, so side by side with that is what are the cultural impacts of that? And what we do is that we'll come in and we'll say, okay, let's first help leadership figure out, based on the strategy that you have and the goals that you set forth, let's build the right framing story behind this. I use the term story or narrative somewhat interchangeably, but in a really important way because, humans respond very well to stories.
Sure.
It's how we really learn things. It's how we pass information down from one generation to the next. So you can approach a business audience, and a lot of companies are starting to understand this more. But you could throw up facts and figures and talk about market dynamics and et cetera, until people's eyes glaze over. But when you tell them a story about where you are right now and where you want to be and how we're going to get there, what's the journey to get there, people respond in a different way.
Sure.
It becomes more real to them, and they start to see how they fit in, which is really important because you want your people to understand, how do I fit in? Or you want your customers to understand, well, how do I fit in here? What does this mean to me? It's not exclusive to an internal population. So we come in and, we kind of help, pull that thinking together, pull together then, what are the steps, what are the strategies that you want to employ in order to help people move through this change, and to do it in a way that doesn't interrupt what the business is fundamentally doing as much as possible. And coupled with that is leadership. So, sure, it's one thing to say, okay, we're going to create leader talking points or things that we want leaders to do. But the second part of the business, which is an area that I've been flexing into more as of late, focuses on helping leaders through coaching, through performance coaching, become better at what they do and who they are as leaders. And I talk about those two aspects with great, intentional purpose, because oftentimes leaders really lean into what it is that they are technically really good at. But being a leader also requires someone to take on a different kind of role.
Totally.
There's a certain level of symbolism and authority behind just being a leader. So how are you standing up within that role? And how do you want to or need to stand up in that role? What are you blinded to? And how can we then, through coaching, get you to the place where you want to or you need to be?
No, I think that's really cool that you're doing this, because the main reason I wanted to have you on the show is because I think what ends up happening is a lot of the audience that listens to the show are kind of doing a startup or involved in a startup, and sometimes they start off as like a two-man team, and then over 3 to 5 years they might grow to hundreds of people, and just going through like huge organizational changes like that is a huge issue in kind of the startup kind of space and in a lot of other industries. But just with my own experience in that, where I've seen teams grow kind of quite fast and quite it can be quite challenging with trying to figure out, how do we restructure the culture? We don't want to ruin the culture, but it obviously needs to change now that, there's going to be, potentially people on different floors, maybe even in different buildings, maybe across the country or in other, maybe even in other countries. Right. And so I just kind of wanted you, that's kind of why I wanted to have you on the show originally, because that really resonates with not only myself, but I'm sure tons of listeners out there, because like you mentioned, and as people, maybe it was just you and a friend doing a little project, and now you're managing a team of like 30 people, right? And you're out of your element, like you just kind of mentioned, where now you're kind of managing people, and maybe you're not doing what you're passionate about necessarily. And I think people struggle with that, right? Like myself included.
Oh yeah, I mean it's a really big issue, and it's one that people find oftentimes catches up to them.
Sure.
Like they don't see it coming, and all of a sudden you wake up one day and like you said, wait a minute, we were like two people. It was me and my partner, and now we're 30.
Yep.
And I'm now dealing with all of these management and leadership kinds of things, right? I mean, it was simpler when we were just the two of us doing the work. But on the other hand, I'm building something. I don't want to back away from that. I don't want to suddenly scale down. It's kind of a good problem to have. It's an issue, but it's a good thing to grapple with. And I think that the thing that anyone who is moving up into leadership roles, whether it's, in a rather prescribed sort of steady, career ladder fashion, or suddenly it's sort of thrust upon you because you've been phenomenally successful at what you're doing, your role has changed deeply and fundamentally.
Sure.
And it's really important to put your head around that. You're not the person working side by side anymore. You're the person who people are turning to for direction and support, and sometimes, maybe a weird thing to say, sort of like comfort.
Totally.
a leader, I knew this CIO once years ago who said, a leader does a couple of things. A leader doesn't get down in the weeds. A leader has to understand what's happening, right? You can't just abdicate everything to the people working under you. You have to make sure that you know what's going on, but not on a, day-to-day detailed basis. But you have to set the strategy. So where are we going and how do we want to get there?
Sure.
You help figure out what the work environment should be, the culture, what's important to us. Do we all agree? And how do we want to keep making what's important to us part of how we function on a regular basis so that it becomes infused in what the company is? A good leader clears the obstacles for people.
Okay.
So, if there's an obstacle, a financial obstacle, or there's an obstacle with, clients or having to partner with people, the big, hairy obstacle, a leader clears those pathways so that their people can, keep moving forward again. And then there's this symbolic role that a leader plays, which I think is probably the piece that may catch most people sort of by surprise. Organizationally, you're kind of a different person. You're part of the group, but you're also a little bit detached from the group because you're leading them.
Interesting.
And we all have certain kinds of assumptions about who leaders are and what they need to do. Right now in the U.S., the 2016 presidential cycle is unbelievably fascinating. No matter where you are in the political spectrum, we haven't seen something like that for a long time.
Sure.
And what's interesting is that when you look at who people are supporting, whoever that individual is, whether it's Democrat or Republican, they're looking at that person and saying, yeah, that person gets me.
Interesting.
They're representing either who I am or who I want to be. So organizationally, when you start to move up in that leadership role, there's that dynamic that's going on with the people in your organization, especially people who are either newer in the organization or a couple of rungs down. So being comfortable knowing that people are looking at me in a somewhat aspirational fashion is something I think that is important for leaders to really think about and to become comfortable with.
Sure. I think because I kind of manage a team of designers now, and sometimes I kind of struggle with almost like that role a little bit because like you just mentioned, people kind of look to you for guidance, and sometimes it's just sometimes you don't really know what you're doing, I guess, for lack of a better term, right?
Yeah, exactly. And if I was going to coach you right through this, what we would first start to talk about is what does that do to you? What does feeling that, gee, they're looking at me and I may not have the answer. It's first kind of understanding what is that tapping into in you? Is there some kind of discomfort that you have in being in that role that suddenly being put on the spot is bringing up for you? And then start to work through, okay, how do we kind of look at that objectively? Sure. And then say, well, then what are the things that you can do to help move through that situation? So maybe it's depending upon your relationship with the group and how comfortable you are. Maybe it's saying, I don't have a specific answer right now. Let's work on it, right? Let's lay out everything that's before us and let's figure that out. In Western cultures in particular, that works really well because, we kind of like to feel that, the leader is someone apart from me, but I can also access that leader, right? And they kind of know who I am and there's a familiarity between them. Or maybe in that scenario, you would say, I need to think about it a little bit and then go off and, try and problem solve there. You have a lot of flexibility as a leader in how you react as long as you're reacting in a way that people sense is really authentic.
Okay, that's good advice. That makes sense.
But yeah, no, it's a different game, right? Being a leader is a different game, and the larger your organization becomes, and the further distanced you are within that structure from, the entry-level employees, the more symbolic your role tends to become.
Sure. No, I think that's really interesting, and it kind of gets me thinking about some stuff. But maybe let's transition a little bit. You also have a blog called dailyworklife.com, and there's a lot of kind of really good information and stuff on that. Like, why did you kind of start it, and kind of what kind of stuff do you guys cover on that?
So I started, it'll be 3 years actually in May. I started
Oh, wow, that's awesome.
May of
Congrats.
2013. Yeah, like thank you, sitting in a coffee shop, right? And I wanted to, I like to write, and I had wanted to create a platform where I could really, at first, it was really talking about the experience of working, because having worked within different traditional environments for so long,
Sure.
I really saw the impact that where you work has on you as a person, both positively and negatively. How well do you like the people you work with, right? Do you like the team? Do you believe in the work that you're doing?
Sure.
Or is it just a job? Do you trust your leaders or not? Do you feel that they have, a real concern for you as an individual and as a professional? So, I started to explore into that area more, and lately I've been writing more about leadership and and what it means to be a leader, and how leaders respond, and some of the dilemmas that they face. And I did it partly because I just kind of wanted to get my opinions out there.
Sure.
But also because I wanted to keep exploring some of the ideas that I just talked about. And try and, find a way to develop them a little bit more clearly into sort of like a standing theory. I think that where technology is right now, and the ability for people to put information out on these broad and accessible platforms, and yes, there's a lot out there, so it may be hard for the average person to stumble upon. But the fact that more people now are able to take their experience and take their viewpoints and put it out and, sort of present it for the reading pleasure of anybody who is interested in following it, I think is a really great thing. I think it's fantastic.
No, totally.
Because it allows for more democracy of opinion and viewpoint. I would love to one day be able to take some of the topics that I discussed in Daily Work Life and turn them into a book, turn them into a speaker series, really move forward with that. But right now it's almost like a lab where I'm kind of experimenting at this point.
But
and the response has been good, so I'm happy about that.
But I think that's awesome, and I love the fact that, like you just kind of said, you're basically putting your opinions and thoughts out there, and you're experimenting a bit, and there's going to be people that agree with you, there's going to be people that disagree with you, but that's kind of the beauty of kind of posting stuff online, right? And you create this discussion around it, and you're adding content and you're adding value to people out there, and it's interesting because a lot of people that are coming up nowadays almost like need a mentor or sites or resources to kind of help them through issues that other people have been through, right? And some people aren't comfortable reaching out to somebody and saying, I need help, but they're fine reading, resources online to kind of help them through certain things, right? And I think what you're doing at kind of the dailyworklife.com is doing that.
Well, thank you. And your point about people reaching out, especially younger people coming up, is absolutely Right. Absolutely spot on. When I first got out of college, and working in a more traditional structure, there were programs where there were mentor programs. I mean, but I'm talking like real formal mentor programs, not, I'll find a mentor somewhere, where you would be matched up with someone. And that person, someone who was older, more experienced, would be a sounding board for you, and help, give you advice and answer questions and introduce you to other people. And depending upon how interested you were, you could, really take advantage of that relationship, especially if it was someone who was taking that relationship seriously as the mentor. But over time, there's almost this perspective or this attitude that, we're all individual actors and you're all kind of out on your own. And so you have to navigate yourself, which is good, but to a point. Because if you're looking at someone who is just getting out and, everything is kind of new to them and they don't know what they don't know, without having people that they can turn to, that they can profit from their experience or their perspective, or even look at them as a cautionary tale. Like, if I think about it, I don't know if I'd want to wind up where that person is when I'm that person's age. Without having that, it becomes a lot harder, I think, to build a career. The first, Kevin, I could tell you probably the first half dozen jobs that I had, I was just like trying to find stuff that was interesting to me. I was never the kind of person who had a very serious, well-documented career path. It was more, that looks kind of interesting. All right, I'll try that for a while. And then it wound up opening my eyes to something that, I couldn't have known before I got involved with it. And then I just sort of bounced from one spot to another. But I always had people around me that I could turn to if I had a question, who could provide some perspective. So I think it's really important if people today coming up can find those people or those places where they can start to profit from someone else's experience and perspective to help them figure out what's going to work best for them in the long run.
I think people don't realize, and I would say myself included, that you don't understand how important experience is until you have experience. And it kind of sounds stupid to say, but you're right? Is if you haven't been through something, you don't really know, or you probably can't even comprehend in certain cases everything that could happen because you haven't been through what could happen,
Exactly. It's funny to me. It's sort of analogous to becoming a parent for the first time. I have two kids.
Sure.
A teenager and a middle schooler.
Got you.
And you can read every book out there.
Totally.
And talk to everyone and say, okay, I got it, I'm ready, et cetera, et cetera. But you don't know it deep in your bones until you experience it.
Totally.
And, in many ways, navigating and building a career, building a life is the same thing. And it's important to try and find places or people who can give you their perspective and their experience. And you may not experience it exactly the same way they do. In fact, the odds are you won't.
Sure.
But it's learning. It's knowledge, it's perspective. I had profited from having formal mentors early in my career. And it's a shame that over time, those formal programs have sort of gone away. And now the feeling is, everyone is out on their own. So for people coming up, the question becomes for them, who do I talk to? How can I gain that perspective? Yeah, they may not, someone who's 60 years old, for example, may not really understand what working in a startup environment is like. And, they certainly don't understand different work styles and, things being much more remote and flexible. And, they may not have experienced that as much in their career as me just coming up is going to. But there are some consistencies as far as how people are and how people act within businesses or organizations. What tends to happen when they do have to grow very rapidly or shrink very rapidly, that older person can give you that perspective and kind of searching out, let me take advantage of what other people have gone through and what their viewpoints are, probably can open my mindset up more, and I can just get better from it.
No, that totally makes sense, and I think that's really good advice. So I'm kind of curious. You also contribute to the Huffington Post. What
Yep.
exactly kind of stuff do you cover on that?
So that's more. I have to say, there's not as much rhyme or reason with that.
Okay, well, that's good though.
The first few posts I did for them, and I write for them periodically. I try and write, roughly on a quarterly basis for them because, I want to give more focus and attention to daily work life,
Sure.
Which is my blog. But I first started writing about, the first post actually was about language within a business and the idea of feminine versus masculine language and how just the way that we talk about setting business goals and what we talk about as far as successful results and successful behavior, if it has too much of a tinge of the masculine versus the feminine, do you wind up sort of cutting out the experience of or the wider viewpoint of sort of half of human existence?
Sure.
And what does that mean? What would it mean if a company set goals that maybe used language that was not traditionally masculine in nature? Sort of challenge yourself and see how that changes the way that you look at your work. But I've written about leadership. I've written about for them politics.
Okay.
Sort of through the lens of leadership as well. Not so much like political reporting. So the Huffington Post, to me it's just fun.
Sure.
It's more fun stuff that I write about for them. I had written about, there was one that I really liked, that I wrote about the coach of the Seattle Seahawks. And, he's well known for having a very yoga-centered perspective on, how he trains the athletes on the team and what he has them do. And how, he owned up to a call at the end of the Super Bowl. I think it might have been last year where they ultimately lost. And it was the worst, it wasn't a good call in retrospect, but he was fine with it. And I thought, as a leader, that's phenomenal because he owned up to it. He said, it's one decision in a series of decisions. And although I'm not happy it didn't work out well, I'm not going to kick myself forever on it. I'm not going to hinge everything that I do just on that one decision because that's not realistic. And I thought that was great.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. So I'm kind of curious, how did you end up getting, kind of a writing gig at such a big kind of, publication?
So remember earlier I said I think my life is like I'm the recipient of a series of happy accidents.
Sure.
So I was at a conference. There's a conference that's held in San Francisco each year in February called Wisdom 2.0.
Okay.
And they've been running it, I think, for about 5 or 6 years at this point. And I went in 2014 and 2015. I didn't go this year, but I'm sure I'll go back next year. And the focus of the conference is sort of the connection point between technology, and they've expanded it to, focus a little bit on business too, but technology and wisdom and, these ideas of more Eastern-based philosophies about life and how they're coming together. And a lot of tech companies on the West Coast try and, they offer yoga, they offer meditation, they have roles within their organizations of people who are sort of like the wise one, to help the organization. So this conference brings together all these different kinds of thinkers. So they bring together doctors and biochemists and psychologists, as well as, meditation experts and gurus and business leaders and tech leaders and all that kind of stuff. So when I went the first year, one of the main platform speakers was Arianna Huffington.
Okay.
And, she was talking about language, which, kind of, triggered me to write that first post. And she said in the middle of her speech, and there probably were close to like 1,000 people in the room, she said, and if you have anything that, that you want to share or you want to write about, here's my email address.
Really?
Right? So, of course, I wrote it down. Yeah, I thought that was gutsy, right? To say, oh, by the way, and here's my email address to a room of strangers.
Sure.
So I wrote the piece. I was just kind of inspired to write the piece. I wrote the piece, and then I wrote her, right? She said, here's my email. So I took her up on it, and I wrote her and, noted that, she'd inspired me to write this. And, if she finds it interesting, that's great. But, I wasn't looking for anything specific out of it. And she said, this is fantastic. And, emailed me back, said, this is great. I'm going to connect you with, my editor who's in charge of, our blogging core, and she'll get you set up. So, from that point, then I got set up. So whenever I, want to contribute something, I just, go through, they have, a system, the whole, platform where you submit your post and there you go.
That's awesome. I think that's really kind of good advice for people. Like, these people give their email addresses away because they do want to hear from people, right? And
that's right.
And if you don't ask, you will never kind of receive, right? Like, chances are
Absolutely.
She probably never would have just like picked you out of a crowd and said, "Do you want to write something for me?" Like, you kind of have to take the initiative to do this. And I think that's kind of one of the things that I've been trying to kind of stress through a number of episodes of the show is, things happen to people that basically go after it,
Yes.
And sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't, but at the end of the day, you just need to keep trying until something works out, right? And I think that's awesome how, now you ended up, writing and contributing to the Huffington Post just by basically sending a post yourself, right?
Exactly. And Kevin, the point you make, and there's this fantastic nuance in the point that you just made, that when you do something, you put yourself out there, you try something new, you pursue something. I find that if there's a certain level of detachment you have to the result of it, it just tends to work out better.
Totally.
So, for example, if I sent that email to her and thought, all right, what's my ulterior motive? What am I going to get out of it? She's a very powerful and influential woman. It would have I'm convinced it would have just fallen flat.
Sure.
But I sent it because she inspired me to do something. I had a way of connecting with her, and I sent it to her. And literally within like 24 hours, she answered me back. That was one of those moments where, like, you jump back from the keyboard and you're like, whoa, what just happened?
Totally.
But there was a joy that I had. That's the bigger point, really. There was a joy that I had in doing it. And when you try new things, or you take someone up on their offer, if you're doing it and feeling joy and satisfaction and a sense that, God, I'm doing really what I'm meant to do, what really fires everything that's in me, then it kind of doesn't matter what happens in the end.
Totally.
What matters is that you feel that you're at like your optimum functioning level. Like I get why I'm here. This is great. And then everything that comes after it, is just like gravy. It's icing on the cupcake.
No, totally. I think that's really good advice, and I love kind of people like yourself that are kind of willing to share those stories of how they, because sometimes it seems so glamorous and like you need to like, I don't know how some people describe it sometimes, but people sometimes think it's more complicated than it really is, right? Like you basically wrote a post and sent her an email and we're like, what do you think? You know, you inspired me. And I think at the end of the day, these people are just human beings. And, you know, it's got to be a good ego stroke that if you go to something and you're talking and then somebody that you were talking to was inspired to do something and then sends it to you, you have to feel good about that, right? And like, I know when like somebody comes up to me even and says like, oh, this show like inspired me to do this, you're like, awesome. Like, that's fantastic. You feel great about it, right? And it's, you kind of want to help them out if you can, or connect them with somebody or whatever, right? Like you kind of feel like you just, it's just a good feeling for everybody. And I think it makes a lot of sense. And I love that kind of story.
It's so, you know, in a sense, it taps into this really fundamental human need that we have. And the last post that I did on Daily Work Life talks about that. Humans want to be connected.
Totally.
You know, we want to help each other out, as cynical as we can be. And it's very easy to look out at the world and see everything that goes wrong. But there's just such happiness and joy from, you know, connecting with someone. We're built to want to do that. And when we do it in a way that feels really good for us, then it just keeps paying off the dividend, because then you've influenced that other person, whether you're conscious of it or not. And then if they accept that connection, right, in the fullness that it was meant, then they're going to go out and connect with somebody else.
Totally.
You know, and before you know it, you have a lot of really good things coming along. As opposed to, let me think about what I can get out of it exactly for me, and, you know, everybody else be damned.
No, totally. I think that's really good advice, but sadly we're out of time. So maybe let's close the show with kind of mentioning where people can find, you know, the company, the blog, and any other social media links you want to mention.
Oh, that'd be perfect. So the blog is dailyworklife.com. So just like it sounds, dailyworklife.com. My company website is elysiancommunications.com, which is the spelling of Elysian, for those who are unfamiliar, is ELYSIAN, and then communications.com. You can also find me on LinkedIn. I do posts on LinkedIn as well. I'll, you know, repurpose stuff that I put from the past in Daily Work Life, and I'll post that up on LinkedIn also, and also on Twitter. You can find me on Twitter under my name, Kristina DiPalo.
Perfect, and I'll post those in the show notes as well, so people can go to the website and get those links as well. But I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to be on the show, and, you know, I'm excited to follow your progress throughout the rest of the year and kind of beyond.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Kevin. This has been wonderful. I thank you for inviting me to participate in the show, and I wish you nothing but continued success with it. I hope it continues to grow in leaps and bounds.
Yeah, thanks very much, and you as well. And yeah, we'll be in touch soon, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening. The music for the show is done by Electric Mantra. You can check them out at electricmantra.com and keep building the future.